wooden door closed behind him with a sound that felt final. Outside the training barracks in eastern Finland, snow was beginning to fall in the early December darkness of 1939, and inside that small room, a quiet farmer from the wwii region was being told that his military career was essentially over before it had truly begun. The instructors had made their decision. His shooting, they said, was adequate but not exceptional. His build was too small, his demeanor too reserved. The Finnish military needed soldiers who could inspire confidence, men who looked the part of warriors, and this short, soft-spoken man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed perpetually calm did not fit the image they had constructed in their minds of what a frontline rifleman should be. They would reassign him, support duties, logistics perhaps, something behind the lines where his lack of physical presence wouldn't matter. He didn't argue. He never argued. He simply nodded, picked up his worn rifle, and walked out into the cold. What those instructors didn't know, what they couldn't have known as they made their assessment based on appearance and peacetime training scores, was that this unimpressive man had spent nearly every day of his 33 years in the forests and fields of the Finnish Soviet border region. He had learned to shoot not on a range with painted targets and measured distances, but in the real wilderness where food depended on a single accurate shot, and where wasting ammunition meant your family might go hungry. He had hunted in conditions that would have sent professional soldiers back to their barracks. He had developed a relationship with his rifle that went beyond mechanics, marksmanship. It was an extension of his body, a tool he understood the way a master carpenter understands wood, or a blacksmith understands iron. But none of that translated to the paperwork the instructors filled out, and so he was marked down as unremarkable and sent away from the specialized training that was supposed to prepare men for the coming war. That war arrived faster than anyone expected. On November 30th, 1939, Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border in overwhelming. The Red Army came with tanks and artillery, with air support and numerical superiority that made the conflict seem less like a war and more like an inevitable absorption of a small nation into the Soviet sphere. The Soviet leadership had calculated that Finland would collapse within weeks, perhaps days. They had 5 times the soldiers, 30 times the aircraft, and 100 times the tank. The mathematics of warfare seemed to make the outcome a foregone conclusion. But mathematics don't account for terrain, for weather, for the desperate determination of people fighting for their homes, and they certainly don't account for men who have been underestimated their entire lives, suddenly finding themselves in the exact conditions where their overlooked skills become devastating weapons. The man who had failed to impress the sniper school instructors was sent to his local unit, a regiment tasked with defending a stretch of forest along the border near his home village. The commanders there didn't care about his training scores or his physical stature. They needed every man who could hold a rifle, and if he had grown up hunting in these exact woods, then he knew the terrain better than any map could show. They gave him a position, a sector to watch, and the simple instruction to stop as many Soviet soldiers as he could. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic orders, just the basic reality of war arriving in a place that had been peaceful farmland a week earlier. He took his position in the snow, wearing white winter camouflage that he had made himself from bedsheets, carrying his personal rifle rather than the military issue, and settled into the kind of waiting that hunters know intimately. The Soviet forces were advancing through the forest in formations designed for open warfare, moving with the confidence of an army that expected minimal resistance. They wore dark uniforms that stood out against the snow. They talked and smoked, creating noise and scent that carried through the frozen air. They moved in groups, following paths of least resistance, doing everything that made sense in conventional military doctrine, but everything that made them visible to someone who understood the forest as a living environment rather than just terrain. The first shot came on a morning when the temperature had dropped so low that breath crystallized instantly and metal burned skin on contact. The Soviet patrol was moving through a clearing about 400 meters from his position. They were relaxed, weapons slung, clearly not expecting contact this far from what they believed to be the main defensive lines. He had been watching them for nearly 20 minutes, his body completely still, his breathing controlled, waiting for the moment when his shot would have maximum. Not the first soldier, not the last, the third man in the column, a position where his fall would create confusion about the direction of fire while still leaving the patrol exposed in the game. He exhaled slowly, felt the trigger break with the familiar pressure he had applied thousands of times before, and watched through the iron sights as the distant figure stumbled and fell. The reaction was immediate but disorganized. The patrol scattered, some dropping to the snow, others running for the tree line, none of them able to identify where the shot had originated because he had fired from a position deep in shadow, from an angle that used the natural terrain to muffle and distort sound. He didn't fire again. That was the mistake he had seen other soldiers make, the urge to take a second shot while targets were still visible. But every additional shot was information given to the enemy, a chance for them to triangulate position, an opportunity for return fire to find its mark. One shot. Then silence and stillness while the Soviets tried to understand what had happened. This pattern repeated throughout the first day. Soviet units advancing through the forest, confident in their numbers and firepower, suddenly losing men to shots that seemed to come. By nightfall, 7 Soviet soldiers were dead, and the advancing units had slowed their pace, becoming cautious, suspicious of every shadow and snowdrift. The psychological effect was already beginning. The Red Army soldiers were trained for combat, but this wasn't combat as they understood it. There were no firefights, no targets to shoot back at. Just sudden death followed by silence and the growing awareness that someone out there was watching, turning their overwhelming numerical advantage into a liability because every soldier in a formation was a potential target for an they couldn't see. He returned to the finish lines after dark, moving through paths he had known since childhood, arriving so quietly that the guards barely noticed him until he spoke. When asked how many, he said 7, his voice carrying no pride or emotion. Just the simple report of what had occurred. The commander asked if he needed a different position, better support, orders for the next day. He said no. Same position, same approach. The Soviets would come again, and he would be waiting. There was no bravado in his words, no dramatic declaration. Just the calm certainty of a man who understood exactly what he was capable of doing and exactly how the next days and weeks would unfold. The second day brought a different kind of Soviet response. They sent larger patrols, heavily armed, moving more carefully. They had learned from the previous day's losses that this section of the line was more dangerous than they had anticipated. What they didn't understand was that larger patrols simply meant more targets, and careful movement through unfamiliar terrain was still obvious movement to someone who knew every tree and stone. He had changed positions overnight, moving to a location the Soviets would logically expect to be empty because it offered such a perfect view of their likely approach route. Military doctrine said you didn't put a single soldier in such an exposed position. But military doctrine was written for conventional warfare, and there was nothing conventional about what was unfolding in these frozen forests. The pattern continued. Soviet soldiers advancing, then falling, then their comrades scrambling for cover while trying desperately to locate the source of fire that never revealed itself. He was using iron sights on a rifle without a scope, making shots at distances that would have been challenging for marksmen with optical equipment, but his judgment of range and wind was instinctive rather than calculated. He didn't think about bullet drop or atmospheric conditions in technical terms. He simply knew, the way a person knows how to walk or breathe, what adjustments were needed for each shot. The rifle was a finished design weapon he had used for years, modified slightly with a custom stock that fit his shorter frame perfectly. It was simple, reliable, and utterly unimpressive to look at, which made it perfect for his purposes. By the end of the second day, the count had risen to 14. Soviet commanders were beginning to receive reports of significant casualties in a sector that wasn't supposed to be heavily defended. They sent more troops, assuming the solution to heavy resistance was overwhelming force. This was precisely the wrong response, but it was the logical one from their perspective. They were fighting a war of conquest that was to be concluded quickly, and slowing down for a single defensive position would create delays across the entire front. So they pushed harder, sent more men, and inadvertently provided more targets for the quiet man in the white camouflage who was turning their invasion into a nightmare of attrition. The nights were when the real cold set in. Temperatures plunged to levels that made exposed skin a liability and metal weapons dangerous to touch with bare hands. He would return to the finished positions, eat whatever food was available, and sleep in short intervals that left him alert for sudden Soviet night attack. Other soldiers tried to talk to him, to understand how he was achieving results that seemed impossible. He didn't have explanations that satisfied them. He wasn't doing anything complicated. He was simply hunting the way he had always hunted, except the prey was human, and the stakes were survival rather than food. When pressed for details, he would describe shots in terms of natural landmarks rather than ranges, explaining that he had waited near the split birch until soldiers appeared by the frozen stream, or that he had positioned himself where the hill provided cover while offering a clear line to the forest path. These descriptions meant nothing to soldiers trained in urban combat or open field warfare, but they were the language of someone who saw the landscape as a three-dimensional space full of opportunities, rather than just terrain to cross. By the fifth day, something had changed in the Soviet approach. They were no longer advancing with the confidence of an overwhelming force. Patrols moved with visible tension, soldiers bunching together for psychological comfort rather than spreading out in proper tactical formation. They were afraid, and fear was making them ineffective. Officers shouted orders trying to maintain discipline, but discipline couldn't protect against an enemy who struck without warning and disappeared without trace. The Red Army's technological and numerical advantages meant nothing in an environment where they couldn't locate their opponent, and where every advance meant exposing themselves to fire from an unknown. The Finnish commanders were beginning to understand what they had. Reports from other sectors told of fierce fighting, of desperate defensive actions against overwhelming Soviet numbers. But this one section of the line, this unremarkable stretch of forest assigned to a man who had failed sniper school, was holding without massive casualty, without burning through ammunition, without the constant requests for reinforcement that characterized other positions. They asked him what he needed. More ammunition, he said. Different positions to rotate through so the Soviets couldn't predict his location. Otherwise, nothing. He didn't want a spotter, didn't want communication equipment, didn't want the support systems that military doctrine said a precision shooter required. He worked alone because coordination with others would slow him down and create patterns the enemy could exploit. By the seventh day, the Soviet forces attempting to advance through his sector had effectively stalled. They were still there in large numbers, still theoretically capable of overwhelming the Finnish defense, but they were no longer attacking with the aggression and confidence that characterized the opening days of the invasion. They had learned to be afraid of the forest itself, to see every snowdrift as a potential hiding spot, every shadow as a possible casualty. Reports were climbing, not from massive firefights, but from steady, relentless losses that accumulated until commanders began looking for alternative routes that avoided this particular stretch of border entirely. What made his approach devastatingly effective wasn't just accurate. Other soldiers could make difficult shots under ideal conditions. What separated him was the complete integration of marksmanship with fieldcraft, patience, psychological warfare, and an almost supernatural ability to remain undetected. He understood that every shot changed the tactical situation, that killing wasn't the only goal, but rather creating an environment where the enemy became paralyzed by it. He varied his patterns deliberately, sometimes taking shots at extreme range, sometimes waiting until Soviet soldiers were close enough to hear their conversations. He changed positions constantly, never using the same approach twice in succession, never establishing a routine that enemy intelligence could analyze and counter. The eighth day brought heavy snow, the kind of weather that would normally halt military. But he went out anyway, knowing that reduced visibility would make the Soviets feel safer and therefore more careless. He was right. A large Soviet unit, perhaps a full company, was moving through what they clearly believed was concealed terrain, their formation loose and their attention focused on staying warm rather than watching for threats. He positioned himself on elevated ground where the falling snow would obscure his muzzle flash and sound while still allowing him to see the dark shapes moving below. The shots came at irregular intervals, each one carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. Not a sustained barrage that would allow the Soviets to organize return fire, but irregular, unpredictable strikes that made every moment feel dangerous and every step potentially fatal. By the time the Soviet unit withdrew from the area, they had lost more men to the invisible sniper than they had in several previous firefights with regular Finnish forces. The psychological damage was even more severe. Survivors reported an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, that could see through the snow and strike at will. These reports, when they reached higher Soviet command, were dismissed as exaggeration or panic, but the frontline troops knew better. They had felt the reality of facing an opponent who fought with patience and precision, rather than firepower and fury. On the ninth day, December 8, 1939, the snow had stopped, and the temperature had dropped even further. The forest was absolutely silent in the way that only extreme cold can create, where sound itself seems frozen and movement feels like breaking glass. He had counted his confirmed kills carefully, not out of pride, but because the Finnish command needed accurate reports for their tactical planning. The number was 63, In 9 days of continuous operations, working alone, he had killed 63 Soviet soldiers with single accurate shots from a rifle without a telescopic sight. The mathematics were staggering not just in the raw numbers, but in the tactical implications. 63 soldiers removed from combat meant not just those deaths, but the effect on morale, the degradation of unit cohesion, the time wasted on caution and fear, rather than offensive action. What his former instructors at the sniper school didn't understand when they rejected him was that they were evaluating for the wrong quality. They wanted soldiers who looked impressive on parade ground, who could hit targets in controlled conditions, who fit the military's idealized image of what a warrior should be. They were preparing for the last war, for combat as it existed in theory and training. He had lived his entire life preparing for exactly this war, in exactly this terrain, against exactly this kind of enemy. Every day spent hunting in the winter forests had been training. Every shot taken at moving game in difficult conditions had been practice. Every hour spent in freezing temperatures learning to remain still and patient had been preparation. The Soviet command eventually changed their approach to this sector entirely. They stopped trying to advance through the forest where the phantom sniper operated and redirected their forces to other areas where they faced conventional resistance. They understood how to fight. This redirection created weaknesses in the Soviet offensive plan, opportunities that Finnish commanders exploited to achieve defensive successes that helped prolong the war far beyond the quick conquest the Soviets had anticipated. One man, armed with a simple rifle and intimate knowledge of his home terrain, had influenced the operational planning of an entire army. But the story that would later be told about these 9 days often missed the most important element. People focused on the number of kills, on the technical aspects of his shooting, on the dramatic contrast between the man who failed sniper school and the man who became the most effective individual combatant in the early Winter War. What they overlooked was the quiet revolution in military thinking that his success represented. The Finnish military establishment had been organized around conventional doctrines imported from larger European powers. They trained soldiers to fight in formation, to follow standardized tactics, to value equipment and firepower over individual skill and local knowledge. He proved that in the right conditions, a single person who understood the environment and possessed mastery of fundamental skills could achieve strategic effects that entire units couldn't accomplish. His approach wasn't something that could be easily taught or replicated. It required a lifetime of experience in specific terrain, an intuitive understanding of how weather and light and sound worked in that environment, and a psychological temperament that combined infinite patience with absolute decisiveness. The military tried to learn from his example, tried to create training programs that would produce similar results, but they were trying to systematize something that was fundamentally personal and contextual. They could teach marksmanship and fieldcraft and tactical, but they couldn't teach the deep, almost spiritual connection to landscape that came from spending 30 years living in and from those forests. The wider Winter War continued for months after those initial 9 days, and he continued fighting throughout, his eventual total of confirmed kills becoming legend. But those first 9 days in December 1939 were when he transformed from a rejected recruit into a force that changed how both sides approached combat in the Finnish forests. Soviet soldiers learned to fear the winter woods, not because of Finnish artillery or tanks or air power, which were minimal, but because of individuals like him who turned the environment itself into a weapon. Finnish commanders learned that their greatest assets weren't the weapons and doctrine they had imported from other nations, but the unique skills and knowledge of their own people fighting on their own land. There was no dramatic moment when military leadership acknowledged they had been wrong about him. No apology from the sniper school instructors who had deemed him unsuitable. The war moved too quickly for such reflection, and he himself had no interest in vindication or recognition. He continued fighting because his country was invaded and his home was threatened. The fact that he was extraordinarily effective at defending both was simply a reality he accepted without pride or self-aggrandizement. When other soldiers asked him about his method, he answered honestly but without the kind of detail that would satisfy people. He had no secret. He simply did what he had always done, what the land and his experience. The winter deepened and the war ground on. Soviet forces eventually adapted to the Finnish resistance, learning painful lessons about winter warfare and the dangers of underestimating a smaller opponent fighting on home terrain. The Soviets suffered casualties that shocked their leadership and embarrassed them internationally. Finland eventually had to accept a peace treaty that cost them territory, but preserved their independence. The man who had become legendary in those 9 days survived the war, returned to his farm, and lived quietly for decades afterward, rarely speaking about his wartime experiences except when directly asked, and even then providing only factual details without embellishment or drama. What remained long after the war was the question of how military institutions should evaluate and utilize human potential. The sniper school instructors who rejected him weren't incompetent or malicious. They were following established criteria, measuring candidates against standardized requirements, making decisions based on the best information and doctrine available to them. Their mistake wasn't in their process, but in their assumption that their process could identify all forms of military excellence. They were looking for a specific type of soldier and dismissed anyone who didn't fit that template, never considering that effectiveness in actual combat might require completely different qualities than effectiveness in training environment. This same mistake has been repeated throughout military history, in every army and every conflict. Institutions create ideal types based on past experiences and current theories, then filter candidates to match those types, inadvertently excluding individuals whose unique combinations of skills and knowledge might be exactly what future challenges require. The rigid application of standards that worked in one context becomes a liability when contexts change. The soldier who excels in peacetime training might fail under combat stress. The recruit who seems unremarkable on the parade ground might possess survival skills and tactical instincts that no amount of formal training can instill. His story became part of Finnish national identity, a symbol of resistance and resourcefulness that resonated far beyond the specific details of what happened in those forests in December 1939. But the symbolic version often obscured the real lesson. He wasn't a superhero or a Hollywood invention. He was a person who had spent his life developing skills that happened to align perfectly with a specific military challenge. His effectiveness wasn't magic or innate genius, but the result of decades of accumulated experience suddenly becoming valuable in ways that peacetime society had never recognized or rewarded. The forests where he fought have changed over the decades since the Winter War. The border shifted, populations moved, and the landscape itself has been altered by logging and development. But the fundamental truth that terrain and local knowledge can overcome technological and numerical superiority remains relevant in every conflict where conventional forces face opponents who understand the environment intimately. Modern militaries with satellite imagery and drone surveillance and precision weapons still struggle when fighting in unfamiliar terrain against enemies who have lived there their entire lives. The specific tools change, but the dynamic he demonstrated remains constant. Those 9 days in December represented more than just one man's combat effectiveness. They were a demonstration that military institutions often don't know what they need until circumstances reveal the value of overlooked capability. The same commanders who would later praise his contributions had been part of a system that initially rejected him. Same skills that proved devastatingly effective in combat had been deemed insufficient in training. The same qualities that made him unsuitable for sniper school, his quietness and unimposing physical presence and preference for working alone, were exactly what made him perfect for the actual work of hunting human targets in winter forests. He never claimed to have changed military history, to have single-handedly affected the war's outcome. He was too grounded in reality for such grandiose thinking. But the cumulative effect of his actions, combined with thousands of other Finnish soldiers fighting with similar determination and resourcefulness, did change the trajectory of the Winter War. They proved that the Soviet invasion wouldn't be the quick victory that Stalin's leadership had promised. They bought time for international opinion to shift, for Finland to organize more comprehensive defenses, for the realities of winter warfare to impose costs on the Red Army that Soviet planners hadn't anticipated. The instructors who rejected him from sniper school probably never learned what he accomplished. They likely moved on to training other candidates, evaluating other soldiers, continuing to apply the same standards and criteria that had led them to dismiss the most effective individual combatant their military would produce. There's a certain tragedy in this, not personal, but institutional. An organization can fail to recognize talent without ever knowing what it missed, can establish barriers that filter out exactly the capabilities it will most desperately need. The systems we create to ensure quality and standards can become obstacles to excellence if we confuse measurement with understanding. In the end, what those 9 days proved wasn't that one person can change the course of history through individual action, though that has a certain romantic appeal. What they proved was that wisdom and effectiveness often exist outside the boundaries that institutions establish, that formal training and official credentials can miss entirely the forms of mastery that develop through lived experience, and that the difference between being dismissed as inadequate and being recognized as exceptional sometimes has nothing to do with the person and everything to do with whether circumstances have created conditions where specific skills become visible. And he was the same person before and after those 9 days, the same quiet farmer with the worn rifle and intimate knowledge of the forest. What changed wasn't him, but the world's sudden, desperate need for exactly what he had always been.